Hello, everybody who has tuned into The Glenn Show. Thank you very much for your attentions. This is Glenn Loury of The Glenn Show. My conversation partner, John McWhorter, and I talk here every other week, and I interview varied guests on those off weeks when I'm not talking with John McWhorter for your edification and amusement. This week, we're posting a montage of, if you will, the best of 2024 conversation outtakes between myself and John McWhorter on a wide range of subjects, from Claudine Gay's ill-fated presidency at Harvard University to our respective reactions to the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, to our very distinct reactions to the ascendancy of Donald J. Trump, once again to the presidency of the United States, and varied other topics. John and I have had a fruitful year of dialogue. I think you can agree. And I think I speak for him in saying that we are both extremely grateful for your attentions and for your support. We couldn't do what we do here at The Glenn Show without your support. And I thank you for it. 2024 has come and is now passing. What a year. For me, it was indeed a very momentous year. I had a massive back surgery, a lower spine fusion procedure, 8 hours on the operating table, weeks in immediate post-operative recovery, and months in the extended period of recovery that one has to undergo when one has massive back surgery, such as I have done. Here we are now, almost 9 months down the line from the surgery, and I'm happy to report that I'm doing well. It was also a momentous year for me because my memoir, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, was published in 2024 by W.W. Norton and Company, the venerable publishing house. And it has been, I think I can say, very widely and well reviewed and received. And I am gratified by that. So I invite you to enjoy this summary montage of the best of Glenn and John 2024. I look forward to your continued attentions in the year ahead. We have much yet to cover at the Glenn Show and many new initiatives to mount, about which you will be hearing more in due course. But do enjoy this episode and do continue to support the Glenn Show. We really appreciate it. Happy New Year, all.
Can I ask you something, Glenn?
Yes, you certainly can. I was hoping that you would.
Why did you write a memoir? Why do you wish to share your view of your life story beyond your friends and family? And of course, many people do, but it mystifies me because I'm strange. I will write no such book, I'm pretty sure. What's the purpose? It's a genuine question.
Well, it's not a question that can be adequately answered off the cuff. I will react to your question. I'm not sure I will answer it. I mean, first thing I want to say is this has been brewing for a long time for me. I mean, almost as long as you and I have been talking, and we've been talking since 2008. So that's 15 years. But as a concrete project, it winked in and out of my, kind of not as entirely well organized work plan. What am I doing with my time? What are my professional objectives? I've got graduate students, I've got research projects, I've got my public intellectual life and whatnot. And this kind of loomed as a project in my mind, even in the early teens, even in the aughts. Maybe you could do this. Now, why did it loom as a project? I think I have something to say, and I think I have something to explain. So I'm a public figure in virtue of, being prominent, being heterodox, being outspoken. And I have a track record. I mean, whether I'm talking about it or not, people are talking about it. People are aware of it. I was a Reagan conservative. What was that about? I was a drug addict, hospitalized in a mental institution. What was that about? I was accused of assault with a deadly weapon by a woman with whom I was having an extramarital affair, and it became front page news throughout the country because I was nominated for the undersecretary in the Department of Education position, the number 2 position in the second Reagan administration. And it was while that nomination was pending that this fiasco, this disaster in my life, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on obviously in this vein for a long time. You asked me a pointed question, why did I write the book? I'm saying I had something to explain and I had something to say.
I think part of it then is that you have genuinely led a more interesting life than I have. You have things that people would want to read. I get that.
Well, okay, you're using yourself as a point of comparison, and I guess you don't have any alternative to doing that. You would never write such a book. You say, here I have so written. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you. If you think my life was more interesting than yours, okay, so be it.
Which was.
But that gives me grist. It doesn't necessarily explain why I want to share it with others. And doesn't explain what it means to me. And I've kind of gestured at why I want to explain it to others, because I think I need somehow to contextualize my biographic profile from my point of view, to humanize it and to invite a more sympathetic view of those who will be taking my measure. Maybe that's hopelessly narcissistic of me to be thinking in those terms. And I'm saying
I'm not hinting at that, no.
Oh, okay. But
no, it's genuinely also just what's in you that made you want to write about those things. Yeah, because it really is not. It would not be a natural impulse on my part, and it fascinates me. It's a different way of being and thinking, and so I'm just trying to probe into it.
Thinking about honesty of the problem of self-regard, what I call the problem of self-regard in the book, the idea that you take a measure of your own life, and have you been honest with yourself about what's happening to you? And can you, even in retrospect, be honest with yourself about it? So anyway, I don't want to go into too much of a meta kind of philosophical reflection on self-narrating, which is what I'm doing. I'm sure there are library shelves full of books where people try to understand autobiography from that angle of vision. I have 5 children and 6 grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
I had a 3 decades long marriage to my late wife, Linda Loury, my soulmate and partner, the mother of my children, Glenn and Nehemiah, who passed away from breast cancer in 2011. There's her memory.
Okay. Right.
Anyway, I mean, I want people to know, before we go on, you can pre-order the book. It is permissible to pre-order the book. You can go to your bookseller, your online provider. There will be some links in this post. I'm not going to single out any particular provider because that would be wrong. But you can pre-order the book. Now, why should you pre-order the book? First of all, you do want to read this book. Thanks for allowing me to do this commercial, John, but I'll just be brief. You do want to read this book, okay? You've been following The Glenn Show. You want to read this book. Secondly, I'm told by people who know better than I do that pre-orders get counted in the first week of sales. And that's a big boon toward, being on bestseller lists and things of this kind, which would be good for the book and good for your humble servant. So pre-order the book. Okay, I have an analysis. I see 3 dimensions of quote unquote Black conservatism. One of them is political economy. So you're for free markets and small government, and you're distrustful of welfare. Another is cultural. So you're religious, your traditional values, you're, not with the ultra postmodern new age sensibilities around basic issues. And then the third is just heterodoxy from the consensus opinion about whatever. So, I mean, you don't like affirmative action, or you think reparations is a bad move, or, you're tired of all the belly aching and, kind of victim mongering and stuff like that as a Black person, and you speak out against that. Which is, I think you are not a political economic conservative. You are not a cultural conservative.
No.
You're much more of a kind of centrist Democrat on the cultural issues, and you're much more of a kind of maybe moderately right of center Democrat on the political economy issues. But on the on the Ta-Nehisi Coates' or Ibram X. Kendi's dreadlocks, or the Nicole Hannah-Jones persona, Ida Bay Wells, kind of a persona, what she embodies and what she represents on behalf of articulating African Americans. On Ta-Nehisi Coates, back in the day when he was ascendant, a lot of it was stylistic. A lot of it was, arrogating to himself something about speaking for Black people that you took exception to. But I don't know how much you guys differ on social policy questions and whatnot. I don't know. I'm characterizing you. You might think I'm not doing it accurately.
No, you are. I mean, I am in that third category, and therefore think that the role and significance of racism is vastly exaggerated. Many people think of that as a conservative position, but it has nothing to do with wanting to conserve anything, racism in the past, if we're going to think about it that way. It's just that, and not to drag these people's name through the mud, but it's illustrative because they're very active on Twitter. Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ibram X. Kendi, their lesson from Claudine Gay is it was racism, which I think is extremely oversimplifying it. And I think many people left of center would say that too. But both of them firmly believe that and continue to tweet about it. And I don't think we need to have any doubt that Ta-Nehisi Coates' view would be the same if he were still on that platform. If somebody like me says no, and that's considered a radical statement to say that no, racism was not the reason that she got knocked down, and racism is vastly exaggerated as a reason why there are disparities between white and Black people today. That's considered a radical thing, and there's a shorthand of calling that conservative. But I think that the language and the reality have a very approximate fit at this point.
So I'm moved to invoke my Larry Summers analogy again and wonder about calling that anti-Semitism. And how absurd that'll sound, and how inept it would be for an advocate of Jewish interests to make an argument in those terms.
That it was because
it would just be ridiculous. It would be laughed out of court in a minute, and it would be shown to be a certain kind of, identity mongering. Oh, everything's anti-Semitism now, kind of thing like that. But this is that. Oh, everything is racism now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's rather than, and of course for these people, Blackness is different. Everybody.
But we don't have the wisdom to forbear. We don't have the sense of self to say, no, I won't present myself prostrate to the nation as a monger of my own victimization. Everything's racism, including a wealthy princess of a scion of a elite family with a pedigree that, is as purely selective as it could possibly be, falling flat on her face in the biggest academic job in the country.
But remember that we have to talk.
And we're calling it racism. We don't take any responsibility. We don't, and we think people are going to buy it. And all they're going to do is raise their eyebrow.
Glenn,
and
you and I have been in certain settings. Remember that time we were at Skip Gates's house having dinner, and it was you, me, Larry Summers, Skip, Orlando Patterson, Marceliana Morgan, and some other people, and we were all having dinner. Remember that? This is like 1952. Well, at that,
no, you were out there giving some lecture, weren't you?
Was that what that was? It was when I gave the whatchamacallits.
The boys.
That's right. Yeah, this is so.
I just remember you playing the piano and whatnot.
I did do that. I forgot about that.
Yeah, it was nice.
02. That's right. And in that same setting, I'm sure Claudine Gay has been in that same setting. You're sitting there, you're drinking the wine, and they're the hired caterers who bring out the appetizers and stuff. I'm quite sure that she has various stories she tells of the racism that she's undergone, even as the scion of wealthy Haitian immigrants, because of her dark skin. And so she has stories about being discriminated against at Stanford, I'm sure, because it was very fashionable among Black undergraduates at exactly the time she was there to talk about that sort of thing. And I'm sure she talks about how her dark skin has gotten her discriminated against even by some Black people. I'm guessing, but you've been around after a while, you get to know types. Somebody could type me too. But remember, she thinks of herself as a victim of racism. She's got all sorts of anecdotes. And so the fact that she comes from rich Haitians doesn't matter. It's all about our skin color and all of that bigotry that we all suffer as the result of it. And white people buy completely into that exaggerated mythology, which Tyler Austin Harper has so perfectly skewered in a couple of his pieces. And not to say that he doesn't understand his racism, but people have taken it too far. So yeah, frankly, remember that she thinks of herself as a victim of racism, and that this would be just one more example. She's a late 20th century educated Black person. That's what one thinks. So here we are.
You've heard me talk about Ground News many times. It's the website and app that I use every day to inform myself, cut through the noise, and find the truth. They gather articles from over 50,000 news sources around the world and help readers like you and me break free from big tech algorithms and echo chambers. Go to ground.news/Glenn Show to see how it works for yourself. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed, and it shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. It's really helpful for gaining a balanced perspective in our hyperpolarized world. To show you what I mean, here's a story that's underreported in left-leaning outlets. U.S. to send nearly $6 billion to Ukraine in Biden administration's final days. Conversely, here's a story that's mostly reported by the left and ignored by the right. India alleges widespread trafficking of international students through Canada to the U.S. For both of these, as for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 50% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan that I use. This is the last day to take advantage of this amazing offer. If you're already a subscriber, you can send Ground News as a gift to family or friends for 50% off. Also, there's nothing better than giving the gift of perspective. So make sure you use my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
What's necessary is to refute it. And that's what.
Well, no, the question isn't, I don't think the question is should the film have been acknowledged and recognized. I think the question is how it's interpreted. And I think the question for us is, were we too credulous? Not that we should not have ignored it, but that we should have been more skeptical about it, particularly about its technical claims, which challenge the limits of our own expertise in terms of being able to evaluate them. So we're trusting filmmakers to a certain degree when we do that. All right, you may want to reply to that. Let me just say another thing before you do. I've been asking myself the question, how could I have been so, I almost want to say gullible? How could I have been so credulous? How could I have not had my guard up? And I think the answer is, well, I wanted a counter narrative to the dominant narrative about what happened to George Floyd and the subsequent developments of the summer of 2020. I didn't like that police station being allowed to be burned to the ground. I thought that the lionization of Floyd, the elevation of him to a heroic status to the point that the president, then a candidate of the United States, could say, I'm talking about Biden, in 2020, that Floyd's death resonated. I'm not quoting him, but this was the effect on a global scale. There were demonstrations all over the world, Black Lives Matter and all of that, even more profoundly than did the killing of Martin Luther King in 1968. I hope I don't misquote here, but I definitely believe that President Biden said, then candidate Biden said something to that effect. It was a big deal. It was a big fucking deal, the killing of George Floyd. The country seized up on something. And when the opportunity to question the narrative came along, I jumped at it, and perhaps incautiously so. That's what I want to say, which raises a question in my mind more broadly. Being heterodox, being against the grain, anti-woke, being the black guy who said the thing that black guys are not supposed to say, you can inhabit that persona to such an extent that your judgment is undermined by it. And I take that as a warning. I mean, I'll accept what you say. No, we didn't, do anything wrong. But I'm still a little bit chastened by Radley Balco's, and what he does to Coleman. People can read this and see for themselves. Coleman, the youngish, upstart, conservative black intellectual, is really disquieting. I mean, he says he's way out over his skis. He says, he's a propagandist in so many words. And Barry Weiss takes a hit indirectly from Balco. What kind of outfit is she running over there? Is she subject to the same temptations that we are as we inhabit this role of anti-wokeness, to too quickly embrace something that we ought to think twice about before we jump?
Glenn, you're harder on us than I would be, actually. Frankly, the narrative about cop killings has been lies so often that I think I wasn't motivated by sitting in a heterodox groove and beginning to play the role. With all due humility, I check myself for that as much as I can. However, you can't always be 100% sure. And given how strong the pattern is of the stories of that kind being lies, I think I was quite reasonable in thinking, oh, good Lord, here's another one of these cases. I wouldn't be surprised given the pattern. It isn't that I had some brief where I wanted to, disprove the story of George Floyd. It's that I thought, oh no, because frankly, I had believed it like everybody else, but I was thinking, oh no, is this going to be another one of these things where what we saw was not, what we were told we were seeing was not what was actually going on. And I think what's important is this, Glenn. When Ellison wrote us with his, polite scorn, here's what really happened. Both of us went and looked at the whole report of that pulmonologist. Both of us watched it. I certainly watched the whole thing. And it worried us so much that we called those two people on. That's when we called them on. We asked them questions. By the end of it, we were not saying, we were right. Or at least I certainly wasn't saying it or thinking it. There was kind of a big question mark by the end of it. We did our job. And Glenn, remember, there's a kind of person, kind of people who sometimes would even think of themselves as being in our camp. Think about it. Where they would have gotten the emails from Ellison with that tone of his. You can tell he hates us, but he's trying to do a service. And they would have dismissed it. They would have said, oh, fuck him. Forget it. They wouldn't have wanted to dig in and keep going. We both, frankly, I'm going to pat us on the back. We both had the presence of mind to think, even if this person hates us, we need to look into this more. We did our job.
You said something about colorblindness. What did you say? We were reviewing what we might talk about.
We have so many words.
What do you want to say about colorblindness?
Colorblindness. We have words these days that we can't use clearly. Like it happened with critical race theory. I'm beginning to have a large statement about this. Now it's DEI. I'm sure that you, like me, every 10 minutes are being asked to participate in something where you address DEI. And
CRT, DEI.
And like, what?
Yeah.
Do you mean affirmative action? Do you mean programs designed to diversify an organization? What do we mean? And people mean different things. Actually, Glenn, I want to ask you something. You're in a better position to know this than me. I feel like the number of terms like that floating around these days, including institutional racism, what is racism, what the hell is anti-racism, more of those terms are floating around, making it hard for us to talk to each other now than before. But as a linguist, I know that very often something that's bothering you seems like it just started last week, when really it's been going on forever. Was it like this in the 80s? And I just wasn't there to notice it because I was in college. Do you sense that getting worse? And of course, you might say no.
Well, I think if I understand what you're talking about, which is it's a kind of stereotyping. So because we are identifying the enemy. The enemy are, if I'm on the critical side of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, someone who didn't like Claudine Gay and was happy to see her fired at Harvard, or someone who doesn't like all the affirmative action emphasis that in universities and whatever. I say DEI almost with a sneer, the way my friend Amy Wax would say it, with her lip curling, and you're categorizing a whole, swath of sensibility in the American intellectual spectrum. You have to have a word for it before you dismiss it, a little bit like the way people would use socialist or communist as a derogatory label. Once you slap that label on, and we can move on to the next thing. We know what we're dealing with. They're the enemy, and whatever. Or on the left, the way that people talk about empire. You know how they say American empire. How Cornel West or somebody wants to dismiss the entirety of the U.S. global ambition and footprint as an imperial imposition upon what otherwise would have been a pristine global.
Also,
so they have that of late.
Mm-hmm.
Given the campus as a site of the conflict within American culture and politics about support for Israel, which the Democrats are learning about because of the, what do they call it, non-committed vote in the primaries, where some people have called Genocide Joe, where people are showing up at, who are those people? Well, they're the DEI, CRT advocates. They're the left. The left is also kind of a trope. It's meant, when it's used like that, you can almost guarantee that the speaker is trying to dismiss a whole category of thought with a single swipe.
Right.
And I can't say whether it's more now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It does feel like it, though, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, we live in an era where hashtags can become a thing. Black Lives Matter is an organization and quote unquote a movement, but it begins as a verbal tick, a shorthand way.
I mean, in particular, that we can't even, you get me. We can't even be sure what we mean by these terms. DEI in itself, the first thing I think of is some people sitting at a table in some corporation and wanting to get the word out that Black people and Latino and Native American people are welcome to apply, et cetera, et cetera. And then when people dismiss DEI in that, say, Amy Wax way, a lot of people on the left, here I go, pretend, I think, to think that what she's opposed to is fanning out and trying to diversify a group of people just in that kind of anodyne way, as opposed to the harms that the whole racial preference culture can create, all of which I'm very aware of, can't stand myself. But they pretend that DEI only means what it meant for the first 10 minutes. Or do they really not understand that DEI refers to that Claudine Gay's being appointed in that very high position was perhaps a questionable move and was not based on notions of merit that most of us are familiar with? That's the sort of thing that I mean. It's very hard to talk about these things with clarity. So Christopher Rufo doesn't like DEI. Does that mean that he doesn't like diversity, equity, and inclusion? Of course not. He doesn't like that it has a way of mission creeping into making Claudine Gay the president of Harvard. I'm frustrated with anyway, colorblindness. What do we mean by that?
Which is another example. I just want to be clear. You're offering that as another example of one of these tropes.
Yeah. What do we mean by colorblindness? And so if Coleman Hughes, in his book, which I recommend, is arguing
The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. That's Coleman's book.
And Coleman is instantly told, how can we be colorblind when there's racism? And Coleman says, well, of course racism exists and I revile it, and where it's there, we have to battle it. But the goal is to get to the point of colorblindness. But it's so hard to use the term colorblind in our current culture because people will always jump to the conclusion that what he's saying is, let's pretend race doesn't exist. Now, that's a position that some people would defend, but it's not the one that Coleman is making. And therefore, the term worries me because it creates instant confusion, and you have to spend most of your time cutting with a machete through all those weeds before you can say anything interesting. It's just a term that I find awkward. And I'm not knocking Coleman's thoughts or his book, but it's one of those terms that's hard to use these days.
So I have a suggestion for a column that you could write. Easy for me to say.
Thank you.
So you could take colorblindness as one, and you could take structural racism as the other. You could say colorblindness is the trope du jour favored by those who are critics of the Ibram X. Kendis and the Robin DiAngelos of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so they talk about colorblindness, and you could take institutional racism as the trope of anti-racist activists like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and my colleague Trisha Rose and our friend Ta-Nehisi Coates and all those people. Nicole Hannah-Jones, let's not leave her out. And in both cases, it's not entirely clear what people are talking about. I mean, a little bit more precision would be helpful. So on institutional racism, of course, every time you see a disparity by race doesn't mean that there's some evil force in the world that has produced it. So what are you talking about specifically? And with respect to colorblindness, no, of course you don't mean literally not seeing color. So what exactly are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think the stakes here are pretty high. I think they were illustrated by the contest or conflict between Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson over the Student for Fair Admissions case, where Thomas is basically saying the Constitution is colorblind, and he's saying the 14th Amendment, and he's got his exegesis, and I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying that's what he's saying. And Justice Jackson is saying the country is not colorblind by a long shot. And it seems to me they're like talking past each other.
Yes.
There.
Yes. Or is it that Justice Thomas has a higher wisdom that we muddling around down here dealing with the real world can't quite see? Because we have to be open to that. The Constitution is colorblind, and therefore knock all this stuff off. Even if the world isn't colorblind, that's where we need to go.
Right.
Or, and
that's
I'm inclined that I'm not inclined there, but you can't dismiss it out of hand. But then what does Justice Brown mean? And Jackson mean? And life isn't colorblind, but what do you do about that? Yeah. How do you, this stuff is really hard. They're not talking about the same thing. Exactly. And it frustrates me. So
I'm teaching this in this undergraduate course I'm teaching right now on race, and we're going over the court's decisions last summer in the Students for Fair Admissions affirmative action case. And I must say, I have more than a little sympathy for, it won't surprise anybody, Justice Thomas's position, which is the Constitution is colorblind. I never said the society was colorblind. We're talking about what the Constitution says. The Constitution is our framing document. It's been forged through the second founding of the Republic, which was the Civil War, Lincoln, the post-war amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the reckoning with slavery. A very concrete historical reality of the shaping of American culture and law. Slavery, the legal ownership of persons. They happen to be Negroes, Blacks, African-descended peoples. That's what the court was talking about when it framed the 14th Amendment. And when it said the law, interpreted through subsequent Supreme Court decisions and so on, is colorblind, that's what he means. It's in no way a sociological claim. And yet Justice Jackson's rebuttal and Sotomayor's rebuttal to the majority opinion is saying, how can you say that the Constitution is colorblind when the society is so race conscious and race imbued? And unstated there, I think, is necessary to make their argument work, is the claim that further, of course, everyone's going to have to concede that the society is racially tinged, that the law should be adapted in such a manner as to remedy or confront that racial reality. That's where Roberts and Thomas are saying, no, it shouldn't. We're going by the original understanding of the framers on their reading of the framers, and we're protecting the law, the Constitution. We're not trying to fix the society. We're trying to protect and interpret the framework that's going to guide us, because the 21st century is going to bring new challenges to our republic, like all those Asian students queuing up to get into the best schools in the country, the way the Jews were doing 100 years ago. And we're going forward into the 21st century. We need a framework of law suitable to the mission of preserving America's institutions and so on. So Anyway, that's how I see it.
Keith, this is a genuine question. All of that is clearly, you can't deny any of it. Had Chauvin done that neck thing on lots of other people before?
Yeah, he did,
okay.
But they didn't die.
Okay, and the other people didn't die. And so I think, therefore, we know that not only was it unintentional, but he would have been very surprised that it had that result. He was responsible, certainly, but he had done it before. This is the other thing I want to mention. I see all of this as a conversation that has played out, where Glenn and I saw that documentary, and it turns out that the documentary was misleading in many ways. That seems quite clear, but it was also very well made. It was a brilliant argument. It was like Ciceronian oratory. They did a good job of what they were trying to do. So then we talk about it.
Isn't good propaganda always high quality?
Yeah, they did. And so then we talk about it, and you find out, and you bring us more evidence. Like, you bring us the real deal. And both of us say, oh, wait a minute. And so then, you have this battle between Coleman Hughes and Radney Balco, et cetera.
Are you aware of that? Excuse me, John. I just want to ask Keith, does he know about the Coleman Hughes and Radley Balco exchange? These are two commentators.
I do know a little bit about it, but I didn't read all of their material. I know that they had a dispute, and I know that the man who made the original assertions got rebutted by Balco, and Balco came with some very important clarifying facts.
That's what I know. That was Coleman Hughes, the young critic who made the original pro-police intervention that Balco rebutted. Sorry to interrupt, John. I just want to...
And I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him. Don't know the man, and I'm not familiar with his writings, but now I am. And I'll try to get a little smarter about who Coleman Hughes is.
Take a look at him this last week on The View, where he kicked ass. Frankly, he was so cool, and he took care of himself with that goddamn Sonny Hostin. It was really, really well done. And so, anyway, I was just going to say, we've been learning truth. But frankly, in that very well-made documentary, especially when it turns out that Floyd said, "I can't breathe," long before he was anywhere near the ground. That's a very complex moment. Like, when somebody makes a play about this, I hope that they include that, because it looks like he was kind of using that as a line. It's become kind of a line since Eric Garner, but it could also be taken as that he was practically suffocating while standing up. I make no apology for having been distracted by that. And now you have given more truth, but there was nothing wrong with me and Glenn talking about it. That's my feeling. Yeah, what do you think, Glenn, about how far the war has gone? Because let's say that Israel had killed 1,200 people in response. So there you go. What else? It's a very difficult situation to come to a clear judgment on, but what do you think? Should they blow Rafah down or not?
Well, I don't think they should, because the humanitarian cost of doing so is too high for me. But that's easy for me to say because I don't live in Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to say existential threat. We have to root it out, root and branch, and you got to make omelet. You're going to have to break this particular egg. And then, we're going to do that because we have to do that for our own defense and survival. So the way that the Israeli polity and its government would weigh the relative cost would be different from the way that I would weigh the relative cost. Now, in so doing, in weighing the relative costs in such a way that I would not root out every last tunnel in Rafah at the expense of another 20,000 or 30 or 50,000 dead, based on my assessment of the situation, doesn't make me want to drive the Jews into the sea. It doesn't make me anti-Semitic. It's not Jew hatred. It's a different relative valuation of the relative equities that are at play. That's defensible. Or are you saying they should live with not rooting them out? Yeah, basically I'm saying that. I'm saying the consequence of that, of not living with them without rooting it out, is killing too many people. And that's my assessment.
Especially when it's not clear how you would root them all out.
I mean, if they could give a clearer game plan, there might be a position. But yeah,
I don't know what the morning after looks like here, and the week after, and the year after. I'm not sure. We're managing a problem. That's what Coleman and company tell us.
Yeah, they don't.
I listened to his debate. I listened to Coleman's debate with Bob Wright about this, and he basically, in his pro-Israeli stance, he said, "Look, they got a problem. They got to manage the problem. You know, let's get from here to tomorrow. Let's get from tomorrow to next year. Let's get from next year to next decade. We're managing a problem."
Israel has a duty to its citizens to prevent them from, dying indiscriminately at the hands of terrorists. And so it has to manage the problem. And in the absence of a political way to manage that problem, they have to use their military to manage it. What's the point of forming states if you're going to allow a terrorist group on your border that does what Hamas does? I mean, we might as well live in anarchy.
You could make an argument that if they knew how they were going to root out Hamas and could really reasonably believe that they were going to do it, one could make an argument that 20,000 people have to die because they used their civilians as shields. One could make the argument. I wouldn't be with it, though. Every one of those babies, every one of those people, I think of my own daughters, being crushed in a building. Every one of those people dying affects somebody in that way and loses their life. How much? And you talk about who's bigger. Israel has been bigger in various ways, but I would hope that they could be even bigger and realize this many innocent people dying at our hands is not where we're going to go. It's not that we're going to not kill anybody, but not this much, not more tens of thousands. And that's a lot. Yes. Who am I to say when I'm not living in Tel Aviv and sitting at a cafe and looking and wondering whether something's going to fall from the sky?
That's the point.
And that's hard. Yeah. I know there are many Israelis that feel the way you and I do, but still there are just as many who don't, and they're not all right-wing people either. So it's hard.
John and I often talk about higher education on this podcast. Obviously, that's the universe we both inhabit. And why not? It's a topic that has moved front and center of late at both the state and national level. Free speech on campus, viewpoint diversity on campus, cancel culture on campus, soaring tuition, affirmative action, race-based admissions, accreditation, the erosion of standards, attacks on the classics, hiring litmus tests, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, you name it, it's in the news. So, with all that's going on, and there's a lot going on, to whom can one turn as a trusted resource of all issues related to campus reform, whether you're a student, faculty, trustee, administrator, donor, policymaker, or alumni? One source we want you to know about and strongly recommend as a credible and respected voice on all these issues is the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA, whom we're pleased to have supporting this episode. ACTA is on the front lines, promoting academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability at America's colleges and universities. They don't just serve as trusted advisors to college trustees and alumni, they help arm reformers with resources, ideas, recommendations, information, even grassroots alumni support through their Campus Freedom Initiative. They make positive changes happen, and they approach these issues in a nonpartisan, balanced, informed, highly credible way, which we appreciate. If you care deeply about these issues, as John and I do, you really must know more about the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Start by looking them up on the web at goacta.org. That's goacta.org. And follow them on Twitter and Facebook. Okay, I want to change the subject. I want to talk about Ibram X. Kendi. It's back in the news. Yeah. New York Times Magazine ran, 10,000 words. I don't know how many words that piece was. It went on forever. When I logged on to the Times website, I had the option of listening and having the piece read. And the length of the read was 1 hour and 12 minutes.
Damn.
That's how long that piece was. It would take over an hour to read it out loud.
Damn.
Delving into the trials and tribulations of Ibram X. Kendi, and, how heavy a burden it is that since he broke through with his How to Be an Anti-Racist in the summer of 2020, that rough road that he's had to manage, and very sympathetic, introspective, revealing of some of the flaws and inadequacies of his leadership of his research center. But I thought on the whole, an effort at rehabilitation of the reputation of Ibram X. Kendi. I'm just wondering what you make of it.
Well, what you see from that piece is that he is very bruised by having his ideas criticized. And of course, there have been people out there who I'm sure have threatened violence. And all you have to do is take a peek at Twitter sometimes and see people just recreationally dumping on him. He must see it. And that must be hard. But I think the core of it, especially if you've been watching him for some years, is that he is truly offended at the idea that you wouldn't agree with him. And he genuinely thinks that if you don't agree, as he says in the piece, you either haven't read him or you are, you're trying to pull him down because you've got some agenda of your own. And this is the thing. It's less a story about that as a failing of his than about grievance studies departments. Kendi has his degree, grievance studies. And so, for example, African-American studies, he has a PhD in African-American studies, the African-American Studies Department at Temple University. And the simple truth is, if you're getting a degree in that, you're never really questioned. Your mission is to find instances of racism in the past and the present. It's very rare for anybody to say, oh, but was that really racism? What were your research methods? You found all this stuff, but did you do it right? Or your argumentation is wrong. What wrong argument would there be when the main focus of the department is chronicling racism? Now, the people who run those departments deny that that's what they're all about. And that isn't all of what they're about. But suffice it to say that if you took away the focus on racism, most of those departments would have very little sense of substance, very little sense of a leg to stand on. The blackness that is of main import to study is discrimination against us and its effects, and why you have to think about them when you evaluate the Black condition today. That's what they're about. So imagine being a Kendi where you're in a department like that where you never face any actual criticism. You were just lauded for gathering instances of racism in various ways. You write a dissertation, which in his case is a narrative history, not an analysis, and you're allowed to do that because the department thinks of that as real work. And then you come out into the world, and Kendi is somebody who's chosen not to do refereed academic articles and say what you want to say about that. It means that, once again, no critique. He's never dealt with an intelligent person who doesn't know him saying in polite but firm language, you need to firm up your argumentation. Instead, he puts his argumentation out in trade books, the anti-racist dichotomies and things. He'd never been subject to criticism. And then all of a sudden, here out in the real world, people say, well, Professor Kendi, isn't that a little simplified? Or Professor Kendi, that's so shaky that I get the feeling you're trying to pull a grift over us. I can understand it must have been very disorienting for him, but that means that people shouldn't be getting PhDs without real critique. There shouldn't be a field where you don't have to kind of go through the fire, because what happens is him. That was my sense of it.
I just want to observe that it wasn't just any Afro-American Studies department. It was the one at Temple that he did his PhD. The department run by Molefi Asante, a well-known Afrocentrist with a very distinct philosophy that is noteworthy. And I would say that a PhD from a Harvard or a Yale or a Penn Afro-American Studies department would be a different kettle of fish than a PhD from the Temple Afro-American Studies department.
That is fair. Yes. Because, Asante is not open to criticism either. I mean, that was something that was talked about a lot 30 years ago. Anyway, go ahead.
As I have the utmost respect for Professor McWhorter, I would like to ask if you ever self-assess the strength of your positions on Trump? Frankly, as a longtime listener, I've not heard John make any arguments on any other topic that are even close to how emotional and irrational his conclusions seem to be about Trump. As a young attorney at a big law firm in New York, not one rational lawyer I spoke with thought the Supreme Court would side with Colorado on the insurrection disqualification case, and in fact, the court unanimously rejected that argument. Further, every lawyer I speak with from either side of the aisle agrees that Trump's New York conviction will likely be thrown out, as there were numerous instances of reversible error made during the trial by prosecutor and judge. Lawyers who are not fans of Trump, like Andy McCarthy of National Review or Ellie Honig of the New York Magazine, each have written articles lamenting the disturbing nature of Bragg's actions. This is a long question, but I think it's worthwhile because I want to hear John's answer too. Finally, and most importantly to me, a law nerd, Professor McWhorter calls Trump immoral for his boorish language and behavior at times, even assuming John was right. Manipulating the criminal justice system to attack and convict your political adversaries on trumped up and fictitious charges is more and profoundly immoral. Thus, I beg that John seriously engage with Alvin Bragg's conduct in this case and re-examine his stated position. While I agree that Trump's language and tactics are boorish at times, it's not fair to claim that he incited an insurrection or that an insurrection even occurred, as he left office peacefully as scheduled. If the conduct of the New York City DA and the New York trial court is allowed to stand, we will forever lose the country we once knew. And when revenge is predictably and logically sought against Democratic politicians tenfold, as nobody is above the law, don't be surprised when half the country cheers it on. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. He has the Latin phrase, which I don't know how to pronounce, so I'm just going to give the translation. And that is Joe's question for John.
Well,
John.
There's a lot there, and I don't want to use that phrase as an excuse not to respond to all of Joe's points, but I'm going to indulge in the exercise of trying to be as concise as possible. And so, for example, on the insurrection, I'm open to a legal interpretation that it wasn't one. But I think that here in the real world, it's clear that Trump wanted to interrupt the transfer of power. And if it had happened, he would not have stopped it. He would have been happy. That's what he wanted. That is absolutely appalling conduct from somebody who is responsible for this nation or any of them. As I said about Alvin Bragg, yes, it's clearly a partisan act. Alvin Bragg wants to get him. He's been trying to do it for a long time. And what I said was that I'm sure that he would even admit it later in his life. But because I think Trump is such an extraordinary phenomenon, I would be happy if what Bragg did, despite it being partisan, made it so that Trump couldn't run the country anymore. Now, voting irregularities, I am sincerely not aware that there were more of them last time than there have been in many other elections. If I'm mistaken on that, then I fold. But my impression was that it was pretty much the usual, and that therefore the idea that something wrong had been done, that there was some kind of major malfeasance that merited these irregular kinds of interruptions, I'm just not aware, and I don't think I'm alone in that. And then finally, Joe, I think one thing that you misunderstand, my issue with Trump isn't that he's a bad man. It's not that he's immoral. It's not that he's a pig. It's not that he's a casual racist. It's not that he's nasty to women. That's not the issue. Frankly, plenty of presidents have been a lot of those things, if not all of them. My problem with Trump is that he is a megalomaniacal moron without any sense of moral compass when it comes to, for example, running a country, acting with people who are running other countries. So it's not just that I wouldn't want to have him over for dinner. It's that he's a gorilla. He's somebody who has no business in any position of authority when it comes to government. He can't pay attention.
He's not interested in learning things. It's all about him, etc. So I think that he is perhaps the least qualified person to be running the United States who's ever been put in a position. The only reason that he's in that position is because of the nature of social media and technology. Not to mention that we're in one of those waves in United States history where there are a large number of people who are susceptible to someone saying, we're going to change everything and bring the country back to you. That happens, but now it's happened with social media. And so Trump has a certain charisma. And as a result, this 5-year-old ends up running the country not once, but twice. It's not that he's immoral. It's not that he's Archie Bunker.
How does a 5-year-old take over a national political party, get himself twice, 3 times nominated for the highest office in the land, carry on the responsibilities of that office for 4 years without the sky falling, and raise scores, nay, hundreds of millions of dollars, dominate the political discussion of the most powerful country in the history of the world? John?
Because he's charismatic.
You're just name calling. You're just wallowing in this Trump derangement syndrome rhetoric without coming to terms with the fact that the Democratic Party for decades, for generations, has failed to build a foundation that was impregnable against this kind of populist criticism. The man, I'm talking about Trump is winning the pre-election polling contest right now and stands a very good chance of getting himself elected again. He's a moron. He's an idiot. He's a child. He's a megalomaniacal. Come on, man. I mean, cut the malarkey, as Joe Biden would say. And besides, you didn't answer the question with all due respect. He said it's immoral to subvert the law, which you acknowledge is being done in order to keep somebody whom you cannot beat at the polls from being able to win an election. That undercuts and debases the currency of American political institutions. And you're for it because you think this guy is an idiot, the guy that more of your countrymen than not stand ready to elect to be their leader?
No.
I mean, have you ever turned the light of introspection on yourself, John, and asked yourself the question about why you wallow in this derangement? Joe needed somebody to speak for him. I'm the guy here, so I'm speaking for Joe right now.
That was brilliant, and I'm sure Joe feels well represented. I'm not sure that I see the Bragg case as immoral. I think that the issues are more complex and subtle. I was under the impression, from what I had read around, I'm not a lawyer, but I was under the impression that it was unlikely to fall on appeal. And yes, it's partisan, but not immoral. I don't see how there's a shut and dried case there. And more to the point, Glenn / if I may, Joe / the rest of the audience. One thing all of you know is that I'm not a joiner. So this isn't me enjoying being part of the gang who like having Trump to hate on. This is my feelings that I get in my armchair looking at what that megalomaniacal, inattendant moron does. And so, yes, he is all those things. And somehow, if anything, I feel like I'm patriotic in not wanting my country to be run by somebody with the mental capacities of one of the smarter baboons. And he's a horrible person. But more to the point, he's utterly incompetent. And more to the point, Glenn / Joe, listening to the things that he's saying now, where in his second term, he would take this country closer to autocracy than any candidate has ever openly said. Now, are we supposed to not take him at his word because the grown-ups will be in charge? Well, look at where that got us. And
hold on. What are you talking about? He'll take this country closer to autocracy? Where's the Congress? Where are the courts? Where's the press? Where's the nonprofit sector? Where are the people in the streets? He's just going to single-handedly, as a dictator, take this kind of hyperbolic awfulizing. Trump is going to become a dictator. He won't leave office. I heard people say that. He's going to get in and he's not going to leave, as if he has the power to stay in office without the complicity of the other branches of government and the other fundamental institutions. The military is going to respond to him after he's no longer legally president of the United States. It's just hysteria.
I said closer. It's not going to be some kind of magic, but the way he wants to basically persecute his enemies just because they don't like him, the way he's going to surround himself with sycophants and yes men.
Okay.
None of this moves you.
How about this? How about 2007, 2008, Obama emerges? He gives that speech in 2004 at the Democratic National Convention that everybody is not a Black America, not a white America, so whatever he said. He said it very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
Mounted a campaign. I think you have to say he's an underdog running against Hillary Clinton in 2007, 2008 for the Democratic nomination.
Mm-hmm.
And he kicks her ass.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't do it in a day or a week. He does it as the culmination of a protracted intra-party contestation. He beats her out. He outmaneuvers her. The former First Lady of the United States of America, who is the first woman running with a really serious chance of getting elected president of the United States, loses out in a protracted intra-party contest to Barack Obama. He bests her. He puts together a campaign mechanism. It's $1 billion enterprise, pretty much from scratch. He hires and nurtures and sustains a staff of really competent and effective campaign people, and he gets himself elected president of the United States. He writes a best-selling book, Dreams from My Father, before he ascends to the presidency. And he has a vision about relations with Iran, for example. He goes to Cairo and he gives this really important speech shortly after he is elected. He is awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in his first year as president of the United States. Kamala Harris is no Barack Obama, a person could say. A person could say that while there are some superficial similarities between Kamala in 2024 and Obama in 2008, the differences perhaps are even more important, and those differences do not favor her. And yet, she is the tribune of a movement of the progressive political party in our country. And she's a Black woman. Black.
Don't do that. But yeah, it's very superficial. I mean, but then again, most human beings are not political wonks. It's always about much, much more than what a person's actual policies are. And if all of those Black sorority sisters are excited about her because she's one of them, and she is, I mean, socially, some shared experiences, but if that means that they're going to come out and vote for her and they were going to be less likely to come out and vote for Biden, and it means that Trump doesn't become the president, well, that's the way the social history worked. But I don't know.
What does she stand for? Do you know?
Nobody knows. I'm not sure she knows. She's a politician, and she tilts left when she has to, and she tilts a little bit more rightward when it's convenient to. She doesn't seem to me to have any truly strong convictions like most politicians. She's a politician. She's a Democrat, but that's about it. But I don't think anybody really cares. I mean, okay, there is the abortion issue. That's very important. And she has been assigned that, and I'm sure she feels that very deeply. But in terms of having a vision, as we've said before, I don't think she's quite worked that out yet. But it's just what she is. And people, we've said this before, but I think it bears repeating. It's about the fact that there is a warm tribalism that most people feel. And of course, it's going to have to do with who becomes the president. She looks like me, many people are thinking. And of course, no Chinese student, Chinese or Chinese American, ever says, I can't learn this or I didn't join this field because I didn't have a teacher who looked like me. They've got something behind them where they don't need the teacher to look like them. They feel like they belong to something that looks like them. But we Black people are encouraged to think the person has to look like me. We're getting this in the Olympics as well. And so, she looks like them, she moves like them, she can use a little Black dialect like them. And therefore, that means they're going to support her for president because it's time for somebody like that to be on top, even though we've already had it happen before. It's not deep. It really isn't. I will be interested to see what she has to say when she does an actual press conference. I wonder what she's going to come up with to present
as what she is. And Glenn, maybe she'll become something. Who knows? I mean, despite the fact that many people seem to think she's not the brightest bulb on the tree, I don't get it. She's clearly very intelligent. And she just really hasn't had time to become anything because she was too busy being, a vice president who, one, had not been assigned enough things, and two, I don't think was too terribly interested in the job. But let's see what happens. But all that smiling, is she happy? And is she happy because she might be about to become president? Or is she happy because there are things she wants to do? But showbiz and politics, always, especially today.
Okay, let's take another question. This is from Vladimir X. Shortly after the mass murder of Israelis by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, the two of you agree that the Israeli response constitutes a, quote, defense of Western values and civilization, close quote. 10 months later, with the apocalyptic destruction of Gaza, do you still feel that way? How many more Palestinians must be killed before you two will consider their humanity? Or do you believe Netanyahu, quote, they are subhuman animals, close quote? Okay, Vladimir X, I'm taking your word for it that Netanyahu actually said that. I can't confirm that here right now. And this question is put to both of us. John, you want to respond?
My response to that would be pretty quick. It's the toughest issue I know. But what it comes down to, I'm going to have to resort to something for educational purposes or rhetorical purposes that sometimes can seem like a cop-out, but I don't think it is. I grieve for the numbers of Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, who are being killed because of this issue larger than them, that their leaders put them into, using them as human shields, with these tunnels under all of these buildings. I am aware that there are isolated cases where the Israeli army could have acted better. That's just how war goes. But in general, from what I know, they are doing all that an army possibly could to avoid killing people needlessly. They're trying their best, although it's war, it can't be perfect. What it comes down to for me, Vladimir, is this. If we choose to say that, say, 50, 60,000 is too much under any conditions, and so this simply must stop, Hamas will do it again. Hamas cannot be allowed to do that again, is a feeling that I have, trying to imagine myself on both sides of this. They cannot be allowed to regroup and do that again, not for any reason. And so I would just have to ask you, Vladimir, is your position that we should make it so that Hamas actually could do that again and hope that negotiations would fix that, despite the fact that I don't think any of us really believe that any kind of negotiation would stop Hamas from wanting to do that again? That's a really tough question, and it doesn't lend itself to your understandable tone, which is, now have you seen enough? The question is, if we've seen enough, Hamas will do it again. And I'd like to know what you would do with that. Glenn, that's my answer to that question.
Okay, now here's my answer. By the way, I want to refer Vladimir X and anybody else who's interested to the post that I did in which I reflected at length on how I've dealt with the war in Gaza, both at the Glenn Show and elsewhere in my public ministry, giving speeches and so on. We'll link to that. I'll have the team link to that when we post this response. But I've addressed myself to this at length, greater length than I'm going to have the opportunity to do here. I want to respond to two aspects of Vladimir X's question. Do I think the Israeli response constitutes a defense of Western values and civilization? If I said that then, I don't recall saying that it constituted. I think I might have said its defenders will portray it as constituting a defense of the West. I think I might have said Israel is joined at the hip with the West and represents the West in its confrontation with the forces that are arrayed against it in the Middle East, and that's not just in Palestine. Do I think it constitutes a defense of what the response constitutes a defense of Western values and civilization? No, I don't, frankly. No, I don't. And I've tried to say in part why I think not, but I'll say it here. I think the response is excessive. I don't think what John wants can be achieved, guaranteeing that Hamas will never do it again without killing all of those people. And I think that that's a barbaric thing to contemplate doing, let alone to try to do. And I think, arguably, you can understand what's being perpetrated there as precisely that, killing those people. They're shooting fish in a barrel. This is not a war. This is a police action that is being perpetrated against a largely defenseless population. You say it's Hamas's fault because if they didn't use them as human shields, you wouldn't have to kill them. I think there is some logic in the fact that Hamas lies ultimately at the root of the problem here. But it's not something that just simply fell from the sky, and it's not going to be eradicated by a military action unless, of course, as I say, you kill them all. And I think that's too high a price to pay morally, and that's what I've said. So no. Furthermore, I think the cause on behalf of which it is being undertaken, that is the cause of the defense of the project of creating the state of Israel, the only Jewish state, has tension with Western values. It's not purely an expression of Western values. The ethno-political dimension to the historic movement that has culminated in the state of Israel defending itself now at war all of my life. I was born in 1948. The country has been at war all of my life, is partly an expression of Western democratic values, but it's partly an expression of values that will find no quarter in the political traditions of liberalism because they're rooted in ethnic identity and a state that's built around the idea of a peoplehood, which is decided by blood. And that's not a consistent expression of the values of the noblest values of Western political civilization, in my opinion. Having said all of that, this is hard. Does Israel have a right to defend itself? Yes, of course it has. Does Israel have a right to exist? Yes, of course it has a right to exist in peace with its neighbors. Is anything Israel does okay? No, not in my book. And should I want my country to stand behind Israel, right or wrong, regardless in the face of nearly unanimous world opinion to the contrary? No, I think we Americans should think for ourselves on this. And I think the expression of sentiment that Benjamin Netanyahu embodied when he spoke to a joint session of the United States Congress a month ago or so is not one that I would personally want to associate myself with.
Glenn, are you, this is a genuine question. Are you informed that in order to keep Hamas from doing that again, essentially all Gazans would have to be killed?
Well, no, I informed. That's an opinion of mine. That's a statement of my reading of the situation, consistent, I think, with what's going on right now. They will either have to be killed or cleansed. This is John Mearsheimer's argument, and I think there's merit in it, that the hearts and minds, we're going to re-educate the Gazans so that they are prepared to affirm the right of Israel to exist and live in peace with each other after all the water under the bridge, including this water that's now under the bridge. You see what's being done to those people is a pie in the sky. They're going to either have to be driven out or killed, or they're going to fight and resist to the end. And Hamas is just an expression of a deeper structural thing. Hamas is not an exogenous factor that came in from the outside somehow and now, like a pest infesting your home, has to be dealt with. They are a product of history. There will be a Hamas 2 and a Hamas 3. There will be an Intifada 3.0 and an Intifada 4.0 as long as hundreds of thousands to millions of people live under domination by a foreign power without political rights. And that's how those people are living.
I find myself thinking first, these crying mothers and children, and that they did not bring this on themselves, or they had no idea that they had, in terms of, having Hamas in office. This is not what they were planning for. And you have to really imagine what it's like to lose, even if it's not your life, your life, but also just your entire livelihood. The neighborhood you grew up in is now rubble. The trauma of all of this and happening to so many people. And then I just run up against a wall that I don't know what to do with, which is, short of this, Hamas is explicitly devoted to getting rid of Israel, and it's not just rhetoric. They mean it. And okay, if not them, then some other organization that has the same historical grievance. And then the question is sorting out what the historical grievances are, which is extremely difficult. But they're going to keep doing that. And so the question is, Israel is supposed to deal with the people who are devoted to doing that. How do you do that in a humanistic way? Is there any way of doing it that won't be lambasted as an occupation and denying people their political rights? Where the issue is that people denied their political rights are ones who wish Israel didn't exist and are ready to use force to get rid of it, and showed that they will do something like that by what they did on October 7th, which is recorded with the people doing it with glee. What do you do about that? And what I do know is that there is no simple answer unless pacifism outranks absolutely everything in your view, which I get. But this is one where I find myself thinking, all those people dying, good God. But then otherwise, look at what their leaders are dedicated to doing above all else in life. I'm just saying it's hard. There isn't,
It's not just Gaza. What about the West Bank? It's not just the West Bank. What about Lebanon, Hezbollah?
Look at that.
It's not just the Palestinians. What about the Iranians? What about Iran? I've heard some stuff coming out of Turkey that makes my hair stand on end. I don't know how long the moderate regimes in Egypt and Jordan are going to stand against pressures from below to do something if you continue to slaughter those Palestinians in the tens upon tens of thousands. If you continue to produce martyrs and then hide behind this thing about Hamas uses them as human shields. You're slaughtering those people. You don't have any responsibility for that? In conversation with people, friends of mine, I've been reminded of the U.S. use of firebombing in Dresden during the end of World War II to defeat the Germans, and of the atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to defeat the Japanese. To which my response is basically, you might be able to convince me that those actions were necessary given the tactics of war, necessary to defeat the enemy. You'll never convince me that they were anything other than crimes against humanity, notwithstanding what might have been their necessity. They slaughtered innocents in the boatload. You have blood on your hands. You're drenched in blood. Blood is dripping from your hands. It's not my fault. It's the other guy's fault. I had no choice. If you can sleep with that, okay, go on to sleep. I don't want to have anything to do with it. It's not my fight.
I change my thoughts on this every week, but my insistence is there is no, well, all I know is there is no, well, there is no, I told you so. There is no arms crossed. So how about this? It's too complicated. It's just too complicated.
Okay, well, we can agree on that. And on the fact that there's no pat answer, and the fact that any kind of honest answer requires courage to be willing to say it out loud because it's bound to offend. I noticed that the Democrats at that Love Fest didn't have a voice of Palestinians. They had a voice of Israeli hostage surviving families, but not of any of the Palestinians who were suffered. They genuflected or gestured at some kind of sympathy for Palestinians, but I don't think they stuck their necks out.
They did not.
Mr. Coates, who is back, and he has his book, The Message. So,
have you read it?
Of course not. However, I have read a lot about it. And so, have you read it?
I have, actually.
You actually read it? Oh, okay.
Yeah. The book came out on October 1st, which was a few days ago, and I had pre-ordered it. So it arrived by Amazon, and I picked it up, and I couldn't put it down, frankly. I think the book is brilliant, John.
Do inform me. I'm sincerely interested. Wow.
Well, okay, so the book is called The Message. It's a series of essays which are phrased as an open letter to his writing class students at Howard University from a couple of years ago, where he taught a course, a small seminar on writing. The first essay is a tribute to the art and craft of politically engaged journalism, what journalism is for, as inspiring his students and also kind of characterizing his own raison d'etre. What drives him? Why is he
Glenn,
doing
is
what
this the
he's
part
doing?
where he argues that complexity is a white thing, and that if you're, say, a black journalist, then you should be going not for complexity, but for telling the truth? Is that where he makes that point?
I think it's consistent with his argument, although I don't remember that point specifically, especially phrased in racial terms. But, he does invoke the imperative of, as a black writer, giving voice to the aspirations, frustrations, the kind of political imperatives of his people, the liberationist kind of stance. But it's mainly about writing. It's about not getting too abstract, about attention to detail, about the power of words, about craft. And it's damn good, in my humble opinion. I'm not a literary guy, but I'm reading somebody thinking about words and writing, and I do write. Second essay takes him to Dakar, Senegal, and it's his trip back to Africa, back home, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And it's well crafted, and in places insightful, in places moving, in places predictable, but it is surprising in some ways to me that it's open to a kind of criticism of the romantic, allegorical way in which many Black Americans view going, quote unquote, home. He knows it's complicated. He knows that it, in some sense, is not really home. He knows that they're Black and we're Black, the Africans, the Senegalese, but it's not in any way an identity of, congruence.
Does Coates mention that Africans sold one another into slavery in massive numbers? Does that come up?
I don't remember it being specifically referenced, but it wouldn't have been out of place for him to have taken note of that. I mean, as I say, it's subtle. It's not hagiographic. It's not preachy. It's not triumphalist. Why do we African Americans cultivate mythological narratives about great kingdoms, about African glory, of whatever? And the need to do that is viewed in a critical way. It's not slavishly, reflexively embraced.
Isn't his idea that he's interested in you and me connecting ourselves to Egypt, way up above the Sahara, rather than the West African societies that the slaves who created us actually came from, which were very different places? Isn't the idea that we have a right to create our own mythology, and so we come from the pharaohs and the pyramids rather
that idea is there. I mean, because he knows we quote unquote, the descendants of those people who were transported across the Atlantic as slaves in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries were not Egyptians, and he knows that, but he defends the idea that we would embrace the Egyptian, the grandeur of a narrative in which the greatness of the Egyptian civilization is taken as our own. He defends that. He says we're entitled to our defense of our dignity in the face of the overwhelming derogation of white supremacy and domination of the enslavers.
Glenn, I think that is complete bullshit. And I'm going to ask you something. It's this essentialization of Africanness. The Africans didn't see themselves back then as Africans. They were different peoples, and like all peoples all over the world.
He knows that, John. He knows that.
Warred against each other. Okay. Are you okay with that idea that it's okay for us, especially, in view of the fact that we've got historiography, we know what really happened, that we're supposed to create that mythology?
If I were in the mood to try to construct a critique of this kind of narrative that I'm doing a poor job of sketchily characterizing here, I think the reader ought to engage this work for himself, herself. It wouldn't be hard to do. I mean, who are we? I mean, that's where my critique would start. We, those of us who descend from African slaves, are not merely or mainly African. We're America. We're a product of the cauldron, which has shaped this polyglot continental nation into which the tributaries from many rivers flow. Sure, Africa's a part of it, but we're Negroes. We're the American Negro. And by the way, it's in flux. Kamala Harris, with respect, she's Black. Barack Obama, he's Black.
These are
Half my
interesting identities,
students,
yes.
a lot of my students of color are of various colors and combinations of colors because of the complexity of their own heritage. And in 100 years, it's going to be very, very different from the way it is right now. So
50 years.
The identitarian move that has a we are Africans central theme, I think is deeply problematic. And so all that mythology that gets built on that we is problematic. And it's problematic because the we is highly questionable and very much in flux, and perhaps not something that we should be essentializing and holding on to. But here my point is about Coates, and you should read the book when you get a chance. He knows all of that. And you don't read this book and come away thinking that this is Ibram X. Kendi. This is not Ibram X. Kendi. This is a serious intellectual, contemporary American writer who is reflective about his craft and about his calling, and who I can imagine must have been a completely transfixing and inspiring instructor/mentor for these students.
Well, I did read the book, and I made sure to have my mind open. I didn't hate read it because that would be too easy. I was waiting to find that the reviews that I had read, the reviews that I had led myself to read, my preferences as to who I wanted to see review the book, I wanted to find that what I was expecting was not true. Because to tell you the truth, what interests me is the counterintuitive. Interesting science is counterintuitive. You go through life. The joy is not in being confirmed of one or two things that you already know. The joy for me is, wow, who'd have thunk it? I had no idea. I need to change my mind. Otherwise, why be alive? So I really did go into the book thinking, suppose I don't have a personal issue with him, which I do because of the way he treated me in writing very often 10 years ago. Suppose this is a new writer. Suppose I don't go into it having written a little bit about him before. And I definitely found I had never really read him for the art before. He's got a way with sentences and vocabulary. He's very self-conscious about it, and I guess that's part of why he's so good at it. He and Thomas Chatterton Williams both have that. I read both of them, and I think I wish I had that ability to write with this shimmer. I know I'm not a bad writer, but I can't do what they do. So there was that, and because I find him personally unpleasant.
I just want to make sure I understand. You're crediting his writing as being artistically noteworthy.
Yes. And I've been kind of deaf to it because I don't like him. But if I did like him, I would be much more open to what a beautiful writer he is. He's really got away with a pen. But I'm sorry, Glenn, I read it and then I skimmed it. I really wanted to be fair to this thing. And I'm sorry, Glenn, I'm not impressed. And I'm not just trying to push back against you.
It's all good, John.
As I said last time, I'm perplexed.
I think there's just as big a prospect that he will be viewed, should he be re-elected to the White House, as a historic figure with warts, certainly with flaws, who changed the direction of the country and did so in the face of implacable opposition and reshaped the
political sensibilities of the country in ways that we cannot fully comprehend now. But the end of wokeness, the repudiation of a certain drift leftward in American political sensibilities along a number of different issue dimensions, I think will be the signature sort of bottom line on it.
Yeah, it's funny. I think of him as one of the sparks for wokeness going too far. A lot of that performative peak wokeness was stimulated by a desire to define yourself against him and a sense that his presence was a general emergency, which, yes, at the time could be exaggerated. And then there was a backlash against that wokeness, which was during the Biden administration, when certain people started writing certain kinds of books. Although, no, I'm getting the dates wrong. Because, for example, I started writing Woke Racism. I wrote that under the final months of Trump. But still, the pushback continued under Biden. But what you're saying, Glenn, and this is an interesting historical possibility. Like I just read George Will's biography of Ronald Reagan. And of course, people talked about Ronald Reagan almost the way people are talking about Trump now. Correct. I remember it well. I was practically a grown-up at the time. He was just considered the evil enemy. And George Will's book, you can tell Will doesn't like the man. He doesn't despise him, but Will finds Reagan extremely unimpressive in a great many ways. But there's an elegiac quality to the book. And we can now look at Reagan as somebody who he was a genuine leader in his way, and he changed an era with his leadership, even if it was kind of performative, but then leadership has to be to an extent. Yeah. You're saying that in 40 years, there could be a book about Trump with his face on the front of it, looking presidential, and it's treating him with respect, not as some kind of baboonish, I'm going to stop with the simian references, not as some kind of aberration that thank God we got through, but as somebody who needs to be looked at in a new way. You think they're going to be revisionist histories of Trump?
Yeah. I do.
I'm incapable of imagining it, but sometimes I lack imagination.
Well, this is a man who has dominated American politics for a decade. He comes from, in effect, nowhere. He comes down an escalator. He's an entertainer and a businessman. He's universally despised by the elites who matter. And in the face of withering, unrelenting opposition, derogation, denigration, and one after another, both metaphorically and literally, to assassinate him, impeached twice, Russiagate, the collusion hoax, the suppression of that laptop story, the lawfare stuff. I mean, how many indictments, how many efforts to try to peremptorily disqualify him? In runs around the voters, a demonization of one kind after another, and then nevertheless prevails and becomes the second president in the history of the country to be twice elected independently, not successively, to the office, completely changed the Republican Party, remade the party in his image, etc. How's that not historic? How's that not something that would warrant and deserve the most careful and serious, sustained scrutiny to come to terms with what it means about our country? Because at the end of the day, that's what I think the issue is. The issue is us, not him. It's us.
He's had a major impact. That's true. It's unclear to me a single positive feature of that impact. And of course, people will differ in what they consider positive and negative to be. Yes, he's transformed the Republican Party. He's flushed it down the toilet. He's made it into a cult of personality, united around a kind of facile xenophobia and a comfort with mendacity that goes beyond anything that we saw in either the Nixon or Reagan administrations. And I know this, I'm not saying anything new, but I think those things are facts. I just can't see how we would go to about Trump. I can't see that we're going to look back and think that he did something good
What do you think Elon Musk is up to? Is he an idiot? Is he in the sway of a cult of personality? Is he an opportunist? Or is he a patriot who thinks he knows what's better, not best, better? I mean, there are alternatives here. Kamala Harris is another alternative. The Democratic establishment, Obama 2.0 is another alternative. Better for our country.
I think Elon Musk is a professional contrarian. I think he likes poking his finger in people's eyes. And I think that's part of his fondness of Donald Trump. And I would put that there, because, for example, to be on X, why did he have to rename it that? That's the sort of thing I mean. But to be on X is to see that he forces himself into your feed, whether you want him there or not. And so I see a lot of him every day. And it would seem to me that he likes being the bad boy. Do I think that he genuinely agrees with a significant number of the policies that Trump has put forward? I don't see that as much as I see a glee in getting on people's nerves. That's my sense of him. That seems to trivialize him, but that's what I see from his tweets. There may be more to him. I haven't read a book about him and I don't follow him closely, but that's my sense of it.
I hear no criticism of the losing party, the Democrats, the candidate, the establishment that stood behind the candidate, the attitudes. I mean, the out-of-touch coastal elites who arrogantly thought they could lecture the rest of the country about what was right and wrong on some of the issues that you've mentioned, immigration, for example. Paul Krugman, I think of, just offhand, lecturing from your newspaper, the New York Times, the country, to the effect of, inflation really isn't nearly as bad as people think it is. The economy really is doing much better than the posters tell us that people think it is, and so on. Is there any sense of remorse or criticism of your class? Again, this is a position that I identify you with there, sitting there in New York City.
I'm going to make people mad again. No, frankly, I have tried to look as closely as I can at the extent to which hyper-wokeness and trans issues and a sense of Democrats as lecturing people they consider beneath them swayed the election. And from what I've seen, not meaningfully. I honestly think that the idea that Democrats looked down on the woman running the liquor store in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania that I'm always talking about, and that she voted for Trump because she felt like he likes her, that is something we talk about more than that woman running the liquor store is thinking about. And exit polling seemed to show it. It was inflation, it was immigration, and it was that Trump seems real, which is, what you might be thinking when you're trying to run a liquor store and you have kids. I really don't think that the Democrats did anything wrong, except I think obviously Biden should have dropped out earlier, but how could he have? What human being, what King Lear sees himself tottering a little bit and steps aside? I think that's a lot to ask of someone. And you can't feel how he's inside of himself and he's in a little bit of denial. I'm 59 and I can see that coming. So that wasn't going to happen. Now, anointing Kamala Harris, that was unideal. However, I think that she had her message out very clearly, what she wanted to do for working and struggling people. She said it over and over again, but she didn't have the charisma that the stand-up comedian had. She stumbled a little at the beginning, but she wasn't opaque by the end.
Stand-up comedian.
He's great at
the
it.
stand-up comedian. So
Yes.
So you're in a serious denial situation here, it seems to me. The stand-up comedian has views. He has views about global affairs. He has views about the national economy. He has views about the government and how it's going to be run. He has views which will be reflected in the personnel that he puts in positions of power and influence going forward. The stand-up comedian actually is a political phenomenon, and you're in, it seems to me, serious denial to the extent that you refuse to acknowledge and try to understand what that political phenomenon is. Make America Great Again is now the governing mantra of the party that controls not just the presidency, not just the Supreme Court, but both houses of Congress, of the party that won a landslide election in your country. Man, wake up.
MAGA is a hysterical, mean-spirited, anti-empirical, little 14-year-old boy wearing axe fantasy. It has nothing to do with any kind of reality, the vision of America that man puts forward. And his views consist of, honestly, somebody who thinks he's playing a game of Risk rather than dealing with the real world. I mean, the old Milton Bradley, or maybe it was Parker Brothers game. And as for this deep state business, his views are all about that. This deep state that doesn't exist, which is really just people who don't like him that he wants to get back at. That's all he is. And I'm sorry, that is what I believe. I'm not being reductive. And I do see his main talent, because he isn't a good businessman. His main talent is that he is great at the podium, which I have written honestly, I think in an Atlantic piece back in 2016 or 17. That's the only thing in which he's competent. And it made a big difference. He's
driving the political conversation in your country, John. He's competent at that. He's competent at winning an election by a large margin. He's competent at that. He's competent at taking over a major Republican party and reshaping and redefining it. He's certainly capable of doing that.
He's capable in
He's
the way
back from the dead, man. I repeat. I mean, if it feels good, do it. I do stuff that feels good all the time, even though it perhaps isn't good for me or doesn't make any sense. If it feels good, if that's what you need to do to get through this, all right, my man, I'm with you. Go ahead in your delusion. But it's delusional. It's disconnected from reality.
No, this is not
Trump is probably the most important political figure in the last half century in American politics.
Was the most important virus of the 2020s. Yeah, he's a virus. He's competent. It's funny, I just got finished interviewing Richard Dawkins in Dublin, and so I'm thinking about things.
I want to hear about that.
He's competent like a virus. It's not something that he sits and plans carefully. It's all about, there are people who don't like me and I'm going to get them. And if you feel that way and you have a chance to have a stand-up competence, you might change the Republican Party. He's a virus.
I could understand you saying that in 2015, 2016. I don't understand you saying that in 2024. I don't get it. He is this pathological thing. He's not what he actually is, which is a historic figure.
Hysterical.
Warts and all.
He is a wart.
I'm not going to play that game with you, John. Okay. We will agree to disagree about Donald J. Trump. You will continue to live in your fantasy land. And meanwhile, the actual political history of the country will be written while you stand aghast, agape,
that is actually
bewildered.
Quite true. Yeah. What you just said is true. It's going to be 4 years, and I've consoled myself by thinking two things. One, especially as you get a little older, 4 years is 10 minutes. It's not like he's going to be in forever, even though he seems to wish that maybe he could be. And there's also the black swan phenomenon. And it's very important. We don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knew that, COVID was going to happen. Nobody knew that George Bush, the education president, the second, was going to wind up, steering us into a silly war in Iraq. I, at the time, didn't know it was silly, I'll openly admit, but in retrospect. And so who knows what might happen in 2 years? Frankly, I think it might be the climate. Something is going to steer things in a direction that will be something other than, Matt Gaetz being the attorney general and, RFK Jr. actually being in the government, et cetera. Something's going to happen that will be more than just this, and I will welcome it. But yeah, aghast is correct. I am aghast. Not agape. That's what I tried to get rid of. But aghast, yeah, it's ghastly, and I am aghast.
I am savoring this moment. I'm glad we're having this conversation for posterity's sake. I will revisit it often in the future.